In the previous lesson, we've made an introduction to basics of pivot tables, and the only calculation, or the so-called aggregation, the math calculation we used was the sum. Now it's time to take a closer look on other calculations that are available inside a pivot table. And we are going back right now to the same initial file, which is called sales, with the worksheet data, on which we will do a lot of exercises in the future. We create a table, shortcut Ctrl+T, and then we insert a pivot table, and this is what you will see in many lessons later on. In this exercise, we will concentrate on regions that we place on the rows shelf, and we will start with, once again, sum of sales, which goes to our data source and to the source column, which is the sales, take all of the rows that we have with the numbers in here and sums the values that we can see also on bottom, that on total we should get 31 million. But as you can see in my Excel, you can also quickly calculate other aggregations in Excel, like the average, count, the mean, the max, or the numerical count. These are some of the aggregations that you can find also in a pivot table. So let's try to calculate the average of a single line that we have in here. This means that we need to calculate the sum, which is 31 million, and then divided by the number of rows we have in here, which is 9,426. But we will do this for every region separately, and then also for the grand total. To apply this kind of calculation, we can drag and drop sales once again on the values shelf, and then we can do it on two ways. The first one that I prefer is to right-click the first number that appears in a pivot table and choose Summarize Values By, and then change the aggregation. Checking, for example, the average that we are going to look for. Or the other way is to left-click the tiny black arrow next to the field name on the values shelf, and then pick the value field settings. That will lead you to the same choices that we have in there. And also from here we can pick the average. I prefer the right click on a pivot table and then picking the average, and I'm doing it right now. And you can see also the header of the table changes, and the average for the whole database accounts for 3,323. In the next step, I would like to calculate the number of rows that we've seen in the source table. No matter in which row I am, I always see the count 9,426 plus the header, but we are not going to calculate the header in here. So to get this get this count inside the pivot table, you can take, for example, the sales column and right click it in a pivot table and change the aggregation to count. You can see we get exactly the same number. You can actually pick any other column upon condition it is filled in all of the cells inside the source table. So for example, if I will pick the row ID, you can see it's changing to sum, but once I change it to a count calculation, we will get exactly the same value. So the source table has exactly the same number of rows, no matter which column you will pick. And there is even a faster way to do it. It's better for this kind of scenario to pick the text column, for example, order ID, and it will automatically transform into a count without the need to click anything more. Order ID in our scenario is the text column, so it automatically turns into a turns into a count without the need to right-click anything in the pivot table. We already have the correct calculations, the correct aggregations, but now we would like to format a bit better the pivot table we have, starting with headers and then going to the formatting of numbers. There are a few rules you need to follow. The first rule is your source table cannot contain exactly the same two column names, and the same also applies to your headers of your pivot tables that you can edit just by editing the text that you can see in a cell. For example, I can call this B3 cell total sales, but I cannot give exactly the same name to any other column that we have in here. What is more, you cannot refer also to column names that you already have because they are reserved just for columns. So if I will try to rename my column just to cells, it's not going to react on that. So let us change it to average sales. What is more, as you can see, you're changing also the names of the fields on the values shelf. So it's no longer sum of sales, average of sales. It's just referring to your calculation name that you apply in the header of a pivot table. Now let's move to the formatting of the cells inside a pivot table, and actually they are normal cells, so you could select them and apply standard formatting just by using the formatting you can see anywhere in the interface. You can also right click them and format cells as usually just by applying a specific format, like for example number format. But from my experience, it is more recommended to right click the first cell you can see in the pivot table for a specific value or the so-called measure, and change it by using number format. Number format is a more general approach, something like a rule for any place where you will use total sales, compared to the scenario where you just format cells and you might find yourself in a situation when you are going to lose this formatting. So if you're thinking how to format the numbers, the preferable way is to use the number format and then apply a specific formatting, for example the number formatting. You can see that it has formatted not only my first cell which was selected, but the whole measure, the whole value that I can see in here. And I usually do it measure by applying a specific format and doing it however I want. The same, of course, applies to formatting of the headers. You can, for example, wrap the text in the headers, and you can also format the text you see in here, for example, by changing the alignment in there. They are just normal cells that you can format. At the end of this exercise, let's solve two puzzles for a pivot table. The first question I have to you is how to force pivot table to accept the name of a column which is reserved. I would like to call my total sales just sales, but this name is reserved already for the column name. The answer is you can actually write sales and, for example, place a space at the end. This space is going to be saved by Excel and it's going to allow you to just write sales in your header. This is tip number one. And the second hint and the second question I have is if we take a closer look on the average sales that we got for the regions, we can see that the average for the numbers we see in the table accounts for 3,320 and does not equal the average that we have on the grand total. Why is that? Well, actually, if you imagine what is being calculated for the central region, it's like going by a pivot table to our source table, filtering just the central region, and whatever we do in here doesn't influence the pivot table right now, and it's calculating the sum of sales divided by number of rows, 1988. This is what's happening for every row of a pivot table, for every region we have, but at the end it's not actually calculating the average of the averages that we have, but rather it's like clearing all of the filters that were applied for particular regions, and it's calculating the sum of sales for the whole source table divided by the number of rows. That is why you're not getting the average of the averages, instead you're just getting the average for the whole source table. That's the end of this exercise. We can rename the worksheet to 2.1 and move right now to the do-it-yourself exercise.